so much for joining us today, Andrew. The Green Paper highlights the vulnerabilities and opportunities within our food and agriculture ecosystem and challenges us to think differently about how we prepare for shocks from climate change and supply chain disruptions to geopolitical tensions. So before we dive into the detail, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up researching and writing on food security?
Well, how long have we got? Okay, so thanks for having me, first and foremost. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My journey into this whole world probably realistically began back in 2012 or 13, and I've been spending my 20s travelling around Australia working on cattle properties, overseas in Canada, working on a ranch over there for a period of time, and a few different other things. And got to my late 20s and decided I'd try and get serious about doing something constructive with myself, and ended up falling sideways into a job working as an electorate officer for a backbench politician in central Queensland in the electorate of Flynn, based in Gladstone, which was really good for me because all my family at the time on my mother's side is based around Ralston and are grass-fed cattle producers in that region still to this day. And so it was a really good entree into the world of, at that time, partisan politics, right? Working for an LNP backbencher who sat in the Nationals party room. We were part of the opposition leading into the change of government in 2013, if my memory serves me correctly. It was going back a while ago now. And when the election happened, I had a real passion for two things, agriculture, naturally, and foreign affairs. So I applied for two jobs in Canberra. I had no intention to come to Canberra just to be a political apparatchik. I wanted to work specifically in those two areas of policy, and managed to get a job with Barnaby Joyce, who was the agriculture minister at the time. So down I came to Canberra and spent 3 years working for him, and ultimately ended up through that portfolio managing everything from live animal exports through to climate change, carbon farming, North Australian developments. Spent a brief stint as the wool advisor, which would later serve me well. And perhaps most importantly, was given responsibility of looking after the biosecurity part of the portfolio, which was significant at that time because we were replacing the old Quarantine Act of 1908 with what became the Biosecurity Act of 2015. And so my part in that, years-long process of building a huge piece of legislation that would later become very relevant during COVID, was shepherding it through Parliament, basically. But it was a real privilege and an honour because what that taught me was the value of working across all sides of the political sphere, regardless, because the Senate at that time in 2014-15, necessitated working with Greens and independents and what have you. So it was a real education in how outcomes are achieved up the middle, as opposed to hardline partisan type politics. So I stepped out of that in 2016 at the 2016 election and started my own business, which was at that time an agricultural investment facilitation business, which I plugged away at for about 18 months, trying to help capital find assets as a single shingle operator, and then fell kind of sideways into consulting, being a strategic advisor and what have you to boards and mainly in the agriculture sector. Started out in big egg, the egg industry. Anyway, there's a pun there, but anyway. But also then became the independent chair of the Safe Meat Advisory Group. So if anyone's heard of Safe Meat, it's a platform of engagement between industry and government. That it's like the United Nations of the red meat and livestock sector. And it oversees and considers the policy that sits behind the integrity system that makes sure that the meat that we've eaten today is free of residues, nasties that it shouldn't have, and also meets export country import protocols and all that type of stuff. So that then taught me the importance of back-of-house systems, and how back-of-house systems, if they fail, can have very front-of-house impacts. So it was, I think, 2000. I hadn't been there long, and there was an issue with regard to live cattle going into Japan. There was a trade stoppage, and without going into too much detail, there was some falsification of NVDs, and the Japanese at that time asked whether or not we could prove that our product was in fact lifetime traceable. And that created some challenges for us and revealed that the NLIS system really needed an overhaul. Built in the early 2000s been around for a long period of time. There's an old guy out the back that pedals a bike that runs a chain that, turns the motor over that makes it tick. Anyone who's had anything to do with it would be familiar with how clunky it is. And so we were asked through SafeMeat to use SafeMeat as a means through which we could develop up policy options to reform that system. So that's what we did. We took 2 years and we managed to unite a really disparate group of stakeholders from state and Commonwealth governments, regulators, food safety organisations, peak industry bodies at a national level, around 5 core recommendations to reform Australia's traceability system. So we delivered that to the National Biosecurity Committee in 2020 in March in Orange. And as I was driving home from that, I remember hearing about COVID on the radio, thinking this is going to be interesting. It was amazing how a report that has been submitted to reform and overhaul that system was overtaken by events so quickly through COVID. And we had to find alternate ways to get traction. So I started thinking about the role of the analysis and traceability system in biosecurity preparedness and response, the role of biosecurity in underpinning food security, and then all anyone cared about at that time was national security and the deteriorating bilateral relationship between Australia and China, and the role of food security in underpinning Australia's national security. So I started to write about that. Subsequently made some friends at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and a long story short, it's kind of become my life's mission to annoy defence and national security folks about the importance of food and agriculture and that they should take it seriously and think about it in the same level of importance as ships and guns and submarines.
And one of your key recommendations is effectively that food security should be considered in a similar way to national security. So what do you see as the key threats within that drove that conclusion?
Well, at the end of the day, the most significant threat that we face is the assumption that we're food secure as a nation.
Because we export 70%
that's right,
of our agricultural produce.
And we've been so busy telling ourselves for a long period of time that we do a really good job, and which we do, but what we've overlooked is that productive capacity is entirely reliant on a stable world where rules of engagement, agreements between nations, frameworks around security govern what is a trading system that's been pretty stable for a long period of time in the post-Second World War era. But the fact is the world today is not what it was yesterday, and that capacity to export 70% of what we produce is inherently reliant on critical inputs, which we largely import. So that makes our supply chains incredibly important. It makes our access to the world, our connectedness to the world, incredibly important, and it's something that we completely take for granted. So that's why we say, assuming that Australia will always remain food secure is a very dangerous fantasy.
Yeah, and thinking about that and the global geopolitical context in a post-pandemic world where things are happening on the international stage that we couldn't have imagined a few years ago, and with the sort of being lulled into that false sense of security, I suppose, because we are a net exporter. Do we have a window here of vulnerability that could tip us into a crisis? Like, how close to being in a problematic situation are we at the moment? How much time do we have to act?
Well, there's two elements. I think we've learnt that we haven't learnt the lessons that COVID's taught us. So COVID taught us that we can't rely on supply chains the way we thought we might be able to. And it's also given way to this, again, dangerous assumption that in the context of a COVID-related supply chain disruption, the market will pivot. It'll find another way. The market will prevail. But in the future that's being imagined and prepared for by defence and national security agencies, the market will not be able to pivot in the same way. And so if you read the 2023 Defence Strategic Review and its accompanying document, the 2024 National Defence Strategy, they talk about the fact that we no longer have what has been an assumed 10-year strategic warning time for conflict, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So we've all been watching the news and we've all been watching how China's been expanding in its presence in the South China Sea and asserting its dominance and the friction that that's creating in that region. Those documents talk about the Indo-Pacific as the most geostrategically important region in the world. And for us, it's our lifeline because our solvency depends on a free and open Indo-Pacific and the capacity to be able to bring things in and send things back out again. And so we very much focus on exports in this country, but what we haven't focused on enough is imports and being able to secure those critical inputs that we require to be able to do what it is that we need to do. So COVID's given us a few jolts to say, hey, you're not as secure as you think you are. Hey, there's a ship stuck in the Suez Canal that's creating an impact here domestically. You're not as secure as you think you are. But we're not listening, right? So I'd challenge anyone in the room, and I would be really pleased to hear if people could tell me that their supply chains look largely different now to what they did in 2019. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. Things have just we have this inherent want or need, as we were talking before about the psychosocial elements of this conversation, to want to return to a world that we know, that's comfortable, and we just can't get our heads around the fact that things have fundamentally shifted and changed. And so that's something that we need to prepare for.
So going through the process of putting the green paper together, you would have had lots of conversation across industry, across all kinds of stakeholders. So what surprised you through that process?
I think what's really surprised me, I know I didn't mention this earlier, but what's really surprised me is the fact that on one side of Canberra, we are preparing for a vastly and dramatically different future to what we are on the other side of Canberra. And so if you're in Russell and you're in national security or defence, you are preparing for the most dangerous strategic circumstances since the end of the Second World War. Now, those are not my words, they're the Prime Minister's words. They're the ministers, they're the Defence Minister's words. And that goes back to 2020 in the Defence Strategic Update. And I read that document. That might make me a nerd, perhaps, but
Passionate.
I read that document, and I have an interest in Second World War history. Like many of us would have relatives that fought in that conflict. It was an existential threat to Australia in a way that few other conflicts have been then and since. And the Prime Minister and the then Defence Minister at ADFA, when they were announcing the document, they referenced the fact that we're living in the most dangerous strategic circumstances since the Second World War. Now, to me, that is profound. Having worked for a Deputy Prime Minister and done cabinet briefing and all of that type of stuff, what gets briefed behind closed doors is often vastly different, particularly with this type of thing, to what the narrative publicly is. And so for them to say that, that's not for nothing. That's significant. And that's something that we all need to pay attention to. So the biggest surprise for me at a macro level is the fact that in agriculture, we're talking about wanting to reach 100 billion by 2030. Fantastic. That's a great and noble aspiration. However, what does that matter if on the other side of Canberra, we're preparing for a future where we might be cut off from the world for any period of time through kinetic conflict in the Indo-Pacific, another pandemic? How are we prepared for that, and what will that do to us? So we can't be having a purely economic conversation on one side of our brain and a hardline defence and security conversation on the other side of our brain. We need to bridge the gap between those two things, and that's really been the driving, one of the key motivators behind the Green Paper, and also to take advantage of the House of Reps Food Security Inquiry and some of those other COVID-inspired type events that have happened as well.
So obviously there's a gap there in terms of, like you say, what's happening on one side of Canberra to the other. Looking at those recommendations in the Green Paper, how much do they align to current drivers that might exist in terms of, government drivers and targets around farm productivity? Are there things that exist at the moment that we're building on? How much of this is really future focused and aligned with that national security risk?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of silos that exist across the policy framework thinking, both within government and across industry. And I guess one of the things that we've tried to do through thinking about conceptually the food system and the agriculture sector as a food security ecosystem is to break down those barriers. So it's fine to have silos, but you need to be able to sort of have someone standing up on top of them, looking out, across that, to be able to provide perspective and to join the lines of thinking up. Because again, going to that kind of dissonance between where defence is at and where the agriculture sector is at from a production perspective, we also need to break down those barriers between this conversation around productivity. and all those types of things, because we have this inherent want and perhaps a need to think about the world as it was yesterday, not as it is today. And so I don't think we've necessarily caught up in terms of the public discourse with having the conversation about what productivity looks like in a conflicted environment, for whatever cause let's call it a disrupted environment, for whatever the cause of the disruption. So what does that do to productivity? What does that do to margins? What does that do to security of critical inputs, workforce availability, all of those types of things? If the butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the food security ecosystem, we need to be able to understand the impact of that on production in macadamias. If varroa mite is affecting pollination services, on this side of the ecosystem, what is that going to do to X? Liquid fuel security is the go-to example, because we're just so inherently vulnerable and reliant on it for everything that we do. So, yeah.
So with that in mind, so how would establishing agriculture within a food security ecosystem and thinking about the breaking down those silos, which is absolutely a theme of the Green Paper, so how would that framework materially change the way that we farm and that the agri-food sector operates?
In terms of how we farm, I would say thinking about beyond the farm gate in terms of what we require to be able to do what it is that we do at a very basic production level in a disrupted environment, as close to business as usual as possible. Again, for whatever the cause of disruption. That, to me, is what genuine resilience is about. So making sure that producers are thinking about the world in a very different way, removing the assumptions that they'll be able to fill their diesel order next week, that glyph will be available as and when they need it for next year's planting, cycles and what have you, that they'll be able to get super and other fertilisers, not assuming that those things will be, the availability of those critical inputs will still be there tomorrow like they were yesterday, and that the consistency. So and we've all been experiencing that. The availability of glyphosate during COVID was, depending on where you sat across the ecosystem, was a real issue. Trying to secure super, for example, over the last couple of years has been a real issue. That's a disrupted environment that we have to come to terms with and get used to and start to prepare more for. So I would say, from changing the way we farm, how do we make sure that, farmers are thinking much more strategically and long term, and that goes all the way up to advocacy bodies, industry associations, research and development corporations, and ultimately government. What interventions need to be made across the system to ensure that we have the availability of what we need when we need it to be able to grow food, process it, manufacture it, and critically distribute it to where it needs to be when it's required. So all the way in and then all the way back out again, because ultimately our national solvency depends on that.
So thinking about some of those challenges, agriculture is a highly energy intensive sector, from fertiliser production to machinery and cold storage. I mean, with fertiliser production, gas, for example, we were talking about gas earlier, is a feedstock for fertiliser production. And, we're sort of seeing the discussion happening at the moment around domestic East Coast gas reservation policy. So you have all of those sorts of discussions happening right now. How do rising energy costs and the geopolitical volatility compound the challenge at the moment?
I think, from my mind, it really just demonstrates that we as a collective, both on the government side and industry side, need to be thinking much more strategically about how we build sovereign capability into our critical inputs. And so what we've tried to do through the Green Paper is shift the mindset away from thinking about agriculture, thinking about distribution, thinking about processing and the food system more broadly as a manufacturing sector, to thinking about it as an ecosystem for that reason, because those critical inputs, and particularly energy, are as vital for us as they are for defence. We can't have a situation where defence mobilises for whatever reason and requires stocks of liquid fuels in order to be able to do what it is they do at the cost of agricultural production. So what are we doing to prepare for that? So through the Green Paper, we've tried to offer a series of practical tools that we can equip the public and the private sector with, all the way down to an individual business level, to start to think about risk and threats in a different way we'd manage risk in a business as usual type scenario. So thinking about our vulnerabilities and then prioritising those vulnerabilities and understanding of those prioritised vulnerabilities, what can we manage and mitigate ourselves? We call them preparedness activities in the Green Paper. What can we mitigate in partnership with our neighbours or with our region? What then requires strategic investment from state government, all the way up to what prioritised vulnerabilities require intervention from the Commonwealth. And so there's a section in the Green Paper on rethinking the economic policy framework, and I did try and come up with my own new economic theory, but not being an economist, I was encouraged strongly by some of our stakeholders not to do that. But what that talks about is the need to use that objective kind of vulnerability identification and prioritisation process to strategically intervene in the market where it is most impactful and where it will give us the biggest bang for buck in terms of preparedness. And then using those big off-budget funding mechanisms, like I think I just saw in the news as I was driving in here, the RIC has just got another $1 billion. The North Australian Infrastructure Facility, the Future Made in Australia Act, pick an acronym, there's an off-budget funding mechanism with a whole bunch of money sitting in it, to intervene in the market vastly more strategically than what we've done to date. We need a checklist of prioritised vulnerabilities that the federal government would be responsible, that the state government would be responsible for, and what is private enterprise responsible for. So the Productivity Commission talks in a post-COVID context about, it is a business's responsibility to manage their own supply chain risk, except for issues where national security becomes a consideration. Then there is a role for government to step in. So our argument is when we're thinking about food security and food security as a fundamental pillar of national security, because it means stability, it means maintenance of social cohesion, it means that we're able to continue to feed ourselves in response to a crisis or a disruption, then there is an imperative to be able to strategically intervene using finite government resources as impactfully as possible. So rather than thinking about investment into rural and regional Australia in a very ad hoc, maybe politically motivated way that people might call pork barrelling, we're thinking about infrastructure investments that are critical to mitigating a high priority vulnerability that has impact right across the food security ecosystem. So maybe liquid fuels is a really good example of that, particularly with considerations around sovereign manufacturing capability of low carbon liquid fuels, for example.
So what should industry be? So looking at the recommendations, looking at the themes, there's obviously some core sort of responsibilities that you see should sit with the Minister for Agriculture, with DAF and so on. From an industry perspective, what can and should industry be advocating for and prioritising when it comes to the recommendations?
Well, there's a couple of things that I'm really passionate about. Number one is elevating food and agriculture into a much higher level of consciousness across the apparatus of government. And that means elevating the Agriculture Minister to take on lead agency status for not just the food system, but food security preparedness, so that the Agriculture Minister sits at the Cabinet table and as a permanent member of the National Security Committee of Cabinet with the imprimatur to be able to take action on mitigating those high priority vulnerabilities. That's where the Food Security Inquiry went to recommending a Minister for Food. We came to the conclusion that creating a separate ministry would be adding to an already very crowded, a very crowded cabinet table, that there really isn't much of an appetite across either side of politics to do that, but elevating the Minister for Agriculture would be a really good first step. And then basically, we wanted to see a national food security strategy established, specifically off the back of the recommendations that came out of the Feeding Australia report and subsequent reports. And credit where credit's due, Minister Collins and the current government committed to that before the last election, which is fantastic. And so we now have a policy process in play. Some of you will have seen that there was a discussion paper released on that just last week, that while yes, it is another call for us all to make submissions and what have you, we really need to ensure that as the private sector in particular, we are getting involved and shaping what that strategy looks like and informing, in this case, DAF, of where the critical priorities are around what that strategy needs to focus on so that we make the most of it. This is a once-in-a-generation politically opportunity for us to really make some traction on thinking about food and agriculture in a national security context. And that document, for me, was really pleasing because it does talk about food security in a national security context and the need for it to integrate with the national defence strategy and what have you.
Thank you. Now, one last question for me before we turn to the audience. So, how important is sovereign manufacturing capability and capacity when it comes to agricultural inputs?
Critically important.
Yeah.
Yeah, critically important. So one of the things, I feel like we're a bunch of policy weirdos in this country where we kind of like to intervene in the market when it suits us, and then we like to be laissez-faire capitalists when it doesn't suit us, and we say, we've just got to let the market operate and take care of this. And then we'll go and intervene over here, and then we'll go and intervene over there. If we're going to intervene, we should do it, right? And do it properly. So for me, when the Prime Minister announced a policy around strategic reserves of critical inputs, critical minerals, I found that really heartening because it was a signal that they're prepared to take that kind of action. And so from my mind, if a Commonwealth government is prepared to take action on security of critical minerals, then perhaps we can convince them to also take action on strategic reserves of critical inputs for the agriculture sector. Doesn't solve the long-term problem, but it will hedge against the short-term disruptions associated with supply chain disruptions, what have you. So that's the type of optimism that we have through this process. But I think, when we talk about resilience, resilience means shortening supply chains. And if we're going to shorten our supply chains away from long, globalised, just-in-time supply chains, where do we shorten them to? I think we shorten them to our region across the Indo-Pacific. There's a dual imperative that the government has here for a safe and secure Indo-Pacific for the specific reason, not only because it's good for everybody, but to make sure that we can maintain our critical connectivity to the world, that those supply chains and those maritime pathways through the South China Sea remain free and open. Now, I believe that if we're talking about shortening those supply chains, we can map the strategic and natural advantages of our region and deepen our relationships with our near neighbours across the region in order to be able to use food as a much greater and more effective tool of our statecraft as a nation, with the added benefit of uplifting everybody's economic capability. But then, where we can't and where it's not viable for us to maintain a sovereign capability in a particular thing, perhaps one of our neighbours can maintain that capability. Perhaps our neighbours to our north or to our east. And they're the types of things I think where there's significant opportunity to be able to build genuine resilience, not just for us as a nation, but for our region, which, not only, I say, a safe and secure Indo-Pacific is a well-fed one. And so, that's kind of the modus operandi of what we're talking about.
Andrew, really, some really interesting challenges that you pose there, some that I had never really thought of before. I noticed there's a number of board members and directors and business owners and business leaders here. How should they be thinking about the challenges that you've raised in the Green Paper and I guess this more generally?
In a nutshell, I would highly recommend everybody to go away and read the 2024 National Defence Strategy. Start there and get a really up-to-speed understanding of the future that's being imagined by defence and national security agencies in this country, and then think about what that means in terms of implications for your business. And perhaps a practical step that we've offered in the Green Paper is, as I mentioned before, thinking about managing risk in a way that's commensurate with Australia's current strategic circumstances. So, thinking about risk in a more nuanced way. What are threats? What are risks? What can we manage ourselves? And going through that process of understanding that to prioritise our vulnerabilities as a business. What does our balance sheet look like if in this scenario, in that scenario? But thinking about that in the same with the same lens as defence and national security agencies. That would be my starting point.
Thank you. I'm Brendan from Cobra Ag Marketing in Toowoomba. Assuming your divine ascension into a role where you can make all of this happen and describe the perfect world for us, What does a food secure Australia look like? What capabilities and what does the map look like?
Well, having gone to high school in the City of Churches, which is Queensland City of Churches anyway, divine ascension is not an unfamiliar concept. I think from my mind, a world in which food and agriculture is genuinely understood by defence officials, and one where we are having a conversation about national defence, genuinely including food and agriculture, and considerations around that as a part of Australia's national defence. So giving genuine fulfilment to what defence talk about as this concept of Australia's national defence, which is that we are as strong as the sum of all of our parts. Now that means taking action on what our most high priority vulnerabilities are. So, I think if things play out geopolitically as some fear they will in the time frame that is expected, then we're going to get caught. There's just no two ways about it, and we're going to have to deal with significant disruptions across many parts of the ecosystem. However, in a perfect world, I would love to see, for example, hypothetically, a strategic intervention of the Future Made in Australia Act to build sovereign manufacturing capability of low-carbon liquid fuels, co-located in major growing regions across the country, associated with regional fuel storage capacity. So we're not going all the way to being able to completely mitigate our reliance on liquid fuels and the importation of liquid fuels through the Indo-Pacific, but we are going in genuine ways to be able to create a sovereign manufacturing capability that reduces our reliance on those long supply chains, creates additional market opportunities, as Denis Voznesensky talks about in his book War on Wheat, highly recommended, with regard to enabling those grain growers to have different markets if we're not able to access northern hemisphere supply chains or markets for whatever the reason. Those types of pragmatic actions and a much greater awareness across the whole sector about what our threats and risks really are. And having a situation where no producer's in a situation necessarily, or food manufacturer, processor or distributor, where they're so vulnerable that they're just going to have to close the doors and walk away. Because we have an imperative to be able to continue as business as usual as we can in a disrupted environment, because 30% of the country is food insecure, moderately to severely food insecure at the moment. This is a totally perverse situation that we find ourselves in. And yet we're wasting 7.6 million tonnes of food in this country every year. That's enough to fill the MCG 10 times over. So we're exporting 70% of commodity in terms of what we produce. Marrying those things up and taking those pragmatic first steps is where I'd want to see us start.
Hi, Andrew. Lucy Broad here today from the Crawford Fund for Food Security. Thanks for your comments. Thanks, Justine, for the interview. I just wanted to pick up a quick mention you made of the importance of deepening our relationships with our near neighbours, and was hoping you might expand a little bit on exactly where the opportunity is for Australia, and I guess keeping in mind the US having pretty much withdrawn all its foreign aid from the region.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. I think it's interesting because as we were drafting the Green Paper, it was such a fluid environment, particularly with the announcements coming around US aid. We finished the Green Paper with this concept of regional self-reliance, which talks about Australia's capacity to be able to work with our regional partners around self-reliance. And, personally, I have this vision that, and there's recommendations or policy options in the Green Paper that talk to the need to map our region to understand what our natural advantages are, and then to take action on that. Nicholas Moore, I was fortunate enough to meet him, who was the author of the Invested 2040 strategy that we've referenced in the Green Paper also. Met him at the end of last year and had a good conversation about his travels around Southeast Asia and the fact that food security is one of the top 3 priorities for pretty much every nation across our region. And so why wouldn't we use our productive capacity to be able to partner with those nations where they can offer us something in exchange for something meaningful in return that can then build genuine resilience and work toward that whole concept of regional self-reliance, so that if we are no longer able to access our northern supply chains, northern markets in the same way that we once were, what can we do in our region to be able to ensure that we have the same level of business continuity? It might cost more. Resilience costs money. That's why we aren't very good at it, because if we wanted to be, it was told to me by one of our stakeholders who were experts in the fuel space that if we could be fuel secure in this country and have our own sovereign capability genuinely, but it would have cost us all sort of $2.50 or more a litre, and the public simply won't cop that. So we're victims of not wanting to actually pay the price associated with with establishing that genuine level of resilience. But I think there's a huge opportunity to be able to take advantage of the natural advantages that we all have across our region. And you hear the Foreign Minister talking about a safe and secure Indo-Pacific. And I think we should have the same ambition. I just take it one step further and say that, a safe and secure Indo-Pacific is a well-fed Indo-Pacific.
Andrew, Sam Hole. I work in retail of ag inputs, and I'm just interested in that cost of resilience comment you made. I think we do well with 70% because we can compete because we're efficient farmers generally. Who will pay the premium for that resilience?
So, going to our conversation around rethinking the economic framework that guides government intervention into the sector and into the market, I think if you're able to walk the pathway of that objective process of identifying and prioritising those vulnerabilities, and to guide that strategic intervention according to the level of responsibility. So, is it your responsibility? Is it the manufacturer's responsibility? Is it a industry-wide responsibility, or is this a case where the state needs to intervene or the Commonwealth needs to intervene? I mean, at the end of the day, we're better off having this conversation now about who's going to incur the cost associated with building that resilience into the system now, in the absence of the crisis, rather than doing it in the context of a crisis where then you'll have big, clunky, knee-jerk government interventions that could make business very, very hard for private sector to be able to handle, and incur significantly more cost than what might have been otherwise the case. So I'd say there's going to be a bit of column A and a bit of column B. Consumers are going to have to share some of the cost. Industry is going to have to share some of the cost of building resilience. And then at the end of the day, because there's a genuine public good element to making sure that you can continue to do what you do in order to be able to supply those critical inputs to the production sector or whomever, to ensure they can do what they do, that there'll be a role for government intervention in that. But we're better off having that conversation now and looking at what the lightest touch intervention possible looks like for the least possible cost, noting that those resources are finite, than when there is a significant disruption. I guess that's what we're arguing.
Any last questions? Andrew, one quick one from me. In your work, did you identify any particular industry sector or region that was more vulnerable than any other, or are there any particular areas that need to move on this quicker than some of the other ones?
Not necessarily geographically. One of the biggest things that I learnt through the process, thinking about liquid fuel security, because it's the big one that we all kind of probably consider, and you've had John Blackburn as a guest here in the past as well, and he's very big on liquid fuel security and very knowledgeable. But what I didn't realise is that we're as vulnerable from the port back to the pump as we are from point of refining into the port. So yes, we're importing 98% of our liquid fuels through very volatile trade pathways on ships that we don't own, by the way, which is sovereign shipping capabilities, another issue that we could talk a lot about. But there's a genuine concern around how resilient we are domestically from the port back to the pump, and that goes to the comment earlier about regional fuel storage capability, and just how reliant we are on making sure those bitumen pipelines, so to speak, those trucks that can run from port into regional areas, can continue to operate. So it gave me a new understanding of liquid fuel security in terms of vulnerability, that it's not just a border beyond issue. It's from the border back internally as well. And I mean, thinking about that, a good case study was the strike action that took place at the Woolworths Distribution Centre last year in Victoria, which resulted in empty supermarket shelves everywhere. And for me, that was akin to, if there's a shortage of liquid fuels that mean those trucks coming out of those distribution centres stops, then the impact that has immediately on the broader population is profound. And I'm just outside of Yass. Yass is our local centre, and there was empty supermarket shelves as a result of that. That strike action in one distribution centre in one state. So it just gives you an understanding of how precarious things are.